Good morning, ma'am, and good morning to all of my batchmates. Today, I am Anurag Pankholi is going to present a seminar on visual pathway. So, visual pathway is a series of three order neurons which are linked each other, arising from the retina of eyeball and going to the level of visual cortex, and they carry visual stimulus. Now, coming to optic nerves are not like peripheral nerves. They are not like ulnar nerve, sciatic nerve, and tibial nerve. Actually, they are central nervous system tracts because they are myelinated by oligodendrocytes in various diseases like multiple sclerosis. They in various diseases like the multiple sclerosis, which is a central demyelinate, which are central demyelinating disease, it will lead to damage to optic nerve. Now, peripheral nerves under when peripheral nerves undergo damage, they show some degree of regeneration, but optic nerve do not regenerate at all. Now, as every CNS tract is present within three meninges, so like them, optic nerve is also bound by three meninges. Coming to retina is a 10 layered, 3 celled, transparent, neuronal and innermost layer of the eyeball. It has 10 layers and it is 3 celled layer. It contains photoreceptor cell, bipolar cell and ganglion cell. It is a transparent layer and it is actually a it is actually a inverted structure light because light before entering to the photoreceptor cell, it have to transfer light have to transverse all these layers before before reaching the photoreceptor cell. Light have to transverse all these layers of the retina, then light reach at the level of photoreceptor cells. From here, at the level of photoreceptor cell, the photoreceptor cells actually convert the visual stimulus into action potentials. So action potentials are traveled via bipolar cells and then to the ganglion cells. So bipolar cells here act as the first order neurons in the visual pathway, while the second order neurons act as the ganglion cells. While while the ganglion cells act as the second order neurons in the visual pathway. The ganglion cells have very long axons, and these all axons actually come out from the eyeball at the posterior medial aspect of the eyeball through the optic disc. Now, coming to the division of the retina is divided into nasal half and temporal half. And nasal half is further divided into upper nasal quadrant and lower nasal quadrant. Temporal half is further divided into upper temporal and lower temporal quadrants. Now, coming to visual pathway, as I have already told you that visual pathway is three order visual pathway contains three order neurons. The first order neurons were the bipolar cells. The second order neurons are the ganglion cells, which have very long axons and they make up the whole optic nerve. And at last, uh, the third order neurons actually emerge from the lateral geniculate body, and which I will discuss later. So the first thing which I just want to tell you is visual sensations are crossed sensations, which means like any other somatic sensation which reach at the level of cerebral cortex, actually they reach contralaterally, means the left half of the pain test and temperature will reach to the right cerebral hemisphere and vice versa. In the similar manner, the left half of the visual field of both eyes will project over the right visual cortex, and the right half of the visual field of both eyes will project over the left visual cortex. Now, this is the visual field. Now, first thing is, what is visual field? The area of landscape which is projecting over retina, keeping eye fixed at a point, it is known as visual field. It is divided into the left half and right half, and it is also divided into nasal half and temporal half. For right eye, this is nasal half and this is temporal half. For left eye, this is nasal half of visual field and this is temporal half of visual field. Now, the visual sensations are cross sensations. Left half of visual field will project over right half of the visual will project over the right visual cortex, and right half will project over the left visual cortex. Now, now we'll come to the projection of the visual field over the retina. Actually, the left half of visual field will project at the nasal half of the retina of left eye, and the right half of the visual field of left eye will project over the temporal half of retina of left eye, and the left half of visual field of right eye will project over the temporal half of retina of right eye, and the right half of the visual field of right eye will project over the nasal half of retina of right eye, and also the upper half of the visual field will project over the lower half of the retina, and the lower half of the visual field will project over the upper part of the retina. So all these facts are significant that the image which is formed at the level of retina, it is actually laterally inverted, and also it is upside down. Hmm. Now coming to the uh, from the nasal from the nasal half from the nasal half of the retina from the nasal half of the retina emerges the nasal hemiretinal fibers, and from the temporal half of the retina emerges the temporal hemiretinal fibers. These all fibers actually, after emerging from the optic disc at the level of posterior medial aspect of the eyeball, the they both are present along they both pass backwards and medially to form a structure. The both optic nerve projects backwards and medially, and they form a structure known as optic chiasma. At the level of optic chiasma, the nasal hemiretinal fibers decussate, and the temporal hemiretinal fibers will move to the ipsilateral side. So the nasal hemiretinal fibers here will move to the contralateral optic tract, while the temporal hemiretinal fibers will move towards the ipsilateral optic tract. Now coming to after the optic chiasma, after the optic chiasma, the fibers, the decussated nasal hemiretinal fibers and and the straight temporal hemiretinal fibers will move along the optic tract. Now, if someone asks you what fibers are present in the optic tract, so optic tract has ipsilateral, it has ipsilateral temporal hemiretinal fibers, and it has contralateral nasal hemiretinal fibers. And you can clearly make out from this diagram that ipsilateral temporal hemiretinal fibers are projecting the left half of the visual field of the right eye, and the decussated nasal hemiretinal fibers are projecting the left half of the visual field of left eye. It means they both are projecting the left half of the visual field of both of the eyes. It means this means the optic tract contains the left half of the visual field of both of the eyes. So so this so this so this also states that the visual sensations are cross sensations. So this also states that visual sensations are crossed sensations. Now, from the optic chiasma, before reaching the lateral geniculate body, 10% fibers from the optic tract get separate, and they move towards the midbrain, towards the pretectal nuclei and superior colliculi, while the 90% fibers go to the will move towards the lateral geniculate body. From the lateral geniculate body, the third order neurons emerges, and the third order neurons form the optic radiation, and the optic radiation reaches to the level of calcarine fissure, which is a part of visual cortex, and it has actually two bands of fibers. The first band is present along the parietal lobe, while the second band is present along the temporal lobe, and the fibers which are present along the temporal lobe are also known as Mayer's loop. Now, coming to the lesion of visual pathway. So, if there is any lesion at the level of if there is any lesion at the level of A, it will lead to right anopia, because in this case the right optic nerve is injured or damaged. While at the level of B, as the B contains the decussated nasal hemiretinal fibers, so any damage at the level of B will cause bitemporal hemianopia, because decussated nasal hemiretinal fibers are projecting the temporal field of the both of the eyes. So it will lead to bitemporal hemianopia. While at the level of C, if if the lesion is at the level of C, as I have already discussed you, that visual sensations are cross sensation. The left half will project over the right visual cortex. So at the level of C, it will cause the left homonymous hemianopia. While if the lesion is present if the lesion is present very posteriorly at the level of, or we can say at the level of visual cortex, it leads to left homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. The macular sparing, the fibers of macula are actually spared because macula has dual blood supply. Due to dual blood supply, macular fibers are spared in various vascular lesions. Now, coming to the visual reflex, or the first is the light reflex. Now, coming to the light reflex, when a shine light is perceived at one eye, pupillary constriction occur in in the same eye in which the light is projected. It is known as pupillary light reflex, while the contralateral eye also get while the contralateral pupil also get constricted, and this is known as consensual light reflex. Consensual light reflex. Now, as I have from the before reaching optic tract, some fibers of the optic tract before reaching the lateral geniculate body, actually 10% of fibers emerge out from the 10% of fibers emerges out from the optic tract, and they move to the midbrain towards the superior colliculi and pretectal nucleus. Now, when when a sharp light, when a very bright light is projected over the eye, actually this it causes the stimulation of the both of the fibers of the optic nerve, which is the nasal and temporal hemiretinal fibers, and this cause the stimulation of the both of the optic tracts, because both of the optic tracts contains fibers emerging from the this optic nerve, as the contralateral optic tract also contains the decussated nasal hemiretinal fiber. So the both of the optic tracts will get stimulated in response to the very shine light which is perceived at the level, which is at the with response to the shine light, or we can in response to the very shine light. So it will lead to the activation of pretectal nucleus. Pretectal nucleus so the pretectal nucleus synapse. So pretectal nucleus will activate its neuronal connection with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So through the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, preganglionic parasympathetic fibers will emerge out. So and after reeling in the ciliary ganglion, they constrict the pupil through sphincter pupillae. And as the both of the optic tracts were stimulated, so both of the pretectal nuclei were triggered, the and both the triggered pretectal nuclei will actually activates, or we can say stimulates the both of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So pupillary constriction will occur at the both of the eyes. Now, coming to the accommodation reflex, when whenever any object is placed close to you, or when you shift your gaze from a far object to a near object, three things occur at that time. First, the eyeballs will move medially, and this is known as convergence reflex, while the both of the pupils will constrict, so that the only the light which is coming from the near object is perceived, and it is known as pupillary reflex, because the pupillary constriction is occurring here, So, and the third is ciliaris muscle, ciliaris muscle will constrict, which makes the lens globular and thicker. Now, when you shift your gaze, actually this causes the blurring of the vision. The blurring of the vision stimulates area 18 and area 19. Area 18 and 19, which further activate the certain neuronal pathway, and through the superior longitudinal fasciculus, or more specifically we can say occipitotactile pathway. It triggers the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of the both of the sides, because the blurring stimulates both side of the superior longitudinal fasciculus, and it actually triggers the both side Edinger-Westphal nucleus and oculomotor nerve, and through the oculomotor nerve it leads to the medial rotation of the both of the eyes, and through the activation of Edinger-Westphal nucleus it leads to it leads to contraction of the ciliaris muscle, which makes the lens globular and thicker, and through the sphincter pupillae the pupil will constrict. So this is all about accommodation reflex. Now, coming to clinical, the anopia is the clinical term for the blindness of the eye. Now if blindness is present in half of the eyes, in a, if blindness is present in half vision of both eyes, it is known as hemianopia, and it may be heteronymous and homonymous. If is present on opposite half, then it is heteronymous. If it's present in same side, then it is known as homonymous. Now coming to papillary edema. Papillary edema is when the margin of optic disc becomes blurred and it becomes swollen. This clinical condition is known as papillary edema. Papillary edema is due to the increase intracranial pressure, or we can say due to the cavernous sinus syndrome. In the cavernous sinus syndrome, or we can say intracranial pressure, raised intracranial pressure, it leads to compression of the retinal vein, which leads to the inadequate drainage around the eyeball region. Due to this, the margin of optic disc becomes swollen, and this leads to decreased visual acuity, and in severe cases it may also leads to blindness. Now coming to the optic neuritis. In case of optic neuritis, actually the lesion of optic nerve which result in decreased visual acuity, and in the optic neuritis the optic disc become pale and smaller. As you can see in this diagram, the optic disc is very pale. Optic disc is pale, while the healthy optic disc is actually pink in color, while this is very pale and it is yellow in color. So it is the case of optic neuritis. And the next is Agile Robertson pupil. In the Agile Robertson pupil, it is a clinical condition in which the accommodation reflex is preserved while the light reflex is absent in the eye. Now coming to the last, Foster Candy syndrome. Foster Candy syndrome is when the tumor is present at the base of the frontal lobe, and it leads to the compression of the optic nerve. Then it leads to a group of the symptoms, and it leads to a group of the symptoms, and it is known as Foster Candy syndrome.